things started very normally. Donald Trump came into the strains of "Hail to the Chief." He saluted as the national anthem was played. The Marine Band was there. Everything seemed perfectly calm and normal until around 40 minutes in. That was the moment when everything changed. I heard some loud bangs towards the back of the ballroom. The initial reaction was one of confusion. What was that? And Donald Trump himself has said subsequently, you couldn't tell, was it some big accident with plates being dropped or something going wrong? Time seemed to stand still. And then you saw, I heard some shouts and saw people ducking for cover. It almost moved like a wave through the room, table by table, people ducking. And at that moment, you don't know what's happening, but you think to yourself, well, if everyone else is taking cover, probably a good idea to do the same. And so I dived under the table, as did others around me. I saw some Secret Service men run through. They were going fast. They were sometimes stepping onto chairs, heading towards the main stage. And by the time I emerged to look at that main stage, Donald Trump, Melania Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance had been swept away. In the ensuing minutes, very gradually, slowly but surely, a certain normality descended on the room again. People got back in their seats, started walking around. And then, of course, we later discovered there had been an assailant. He'd made a dash towards the ballroom doors. He'd actually shot a Secret Service agent who was protected by his body armor. And eventually he'd been apprehended and is now in custody.
David, you've alluded to this already, but Donald Trump and those around him have consistently pushed a might is right approach, both at home and abroad. How much does the normalisation of violent speech and violent actions by the Trump administration feed and inflame political polarisation and political violence?
Yeah, I think that's a big problem, and it's probably the underlying story here. At his impromptu press briefing at the White House on Saturday night, which was an extraordinary sight, reporters in tuxedos and ball gowns and Trump himself in black tie. He talked about this being an occupational hazard of being president and suggested if you're a president who does big, important things, then it makes you a target. But I think when one or two reporters raised the question of a culture of political violence with him, he kind of shrugged it off and suggested it was perhaps inevitable, but surely not. And I think it's no coincidence that the past decade that has seen the political ascent of Donald Trump has also seen a surge of political violence, record numbers of members of Congress receiving threats, forced to hire private security, a whole string of incidents, an attack on a congressional baseball practice, of course, two previous assassination attempts on Trump himself, a Democratic state politician murdered, the right-wing activist Charlie Kirk murdered, and the white supremacist march in Charlottesville, Virginia, and just so many other incidents. This is a climate now, and I do think Donald Trump's rhetoric has played at least some part of that. He's sometimes glorified violence, talked about police roughing up suspects to get what they need. Right now, you have his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, associating with Christian nationalism and using very hyper-masculine, fiery, gung-ho rhetoric about the war in Iran, just reveling in these words like lethality and, punching Iran when it's down, and, very sort of very red meat for the base. And perhaps it's then no surprise it inculcates violence in a society already awash with guns.